the unexpected knock. The morning was quiet, the kind of silence that only comes after a long night of rain. The sky was still heavy with clouds, and the city moved slower than usual. Inside a small house on the hill, Sandra sat by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. She looked out, lost in thought, her mind drifting between what was and what could have been. Life had been strange lately. After years of working endlessly, chasing roles and pretending to be fine, she had reached a point where peace felt foreign. Fame had given her everything except stillness. Her home was filled with light and silence, yet both felt empty. She didn't realize how much she missed having someone who understood the quiet parts of her heart. That was when she heard it. A knock. It wasn't loud, just a single, careful knock. Almost hesitant, as if the person on the other side was unsure whether they should even be there. She froze. It wasn't often that anyone came by unannounced. She wasn't expecting anyone. For a moment, she thought she might have imagined it, but then came another knock. Softer this time. She walked slowly to the door, her steps echoing in the empty hall. When she opened it, her breath caught. Standing there with rain still clinging to his hair was Keanu Reeves. He looked tired, but his eyes carried the same quiet strength she remembered. It had been years since they last saw each other, years since they both walked away from the movie set that had changed their lives. Yet in that moment, it felt like time had folded in on itself. "Hi," he said simply. His voice was soft, but there was something behind it. Something that felt like an apology or maybe a question. Sandra didn't speak for a few seconds. She just looked at him, trying to understand why he was there. Finally, she stepped aside and said, "You're soaked. Come in." Keanu smiled faintly, brushing a few strands of wet hair away from his face as he stepped inside. The air between them was filled with years of unspoken words. She handed him a towel, and he took it with quiet gratitude. "I didn't know you still lived here," he said, looking around the room. His eyes lingered on a few photographs on the shelf. Old memories of sets, laughter, and moments that once felt infinite. "I don't, usually," she said, sitting down. "I come here when I need space." Keanu nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "I get that." For a while, neither of them spoke. The rain started again outside, tapping gently against the glass. It felt like the world was pausing just for them. Then Sandra broke the silence. "So," she said, "why are you here, Keanu?" He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because I didn't know where else to go." Those words hung in the air, raw and honest. She could see it in his face. Something was wrong. He wasn't the calm, centered man the world saw on screen. He looked like someone carrying a weight too heavy to hold alone. "Is everything okay?" she asked quietly. He hesitated before answering. "I lost someone," he said finally. "Someone I cared about. And suddenly all the noise around me just stopped." Sandra's heart softened. She knew that pain too well, the kind that doesn't fade, the kind that teaches you how fragile everything is. She moved a little closer, her voice gentle. "You don't have to say anything if it hurts." Keanu shook his head. "It's not that," he said. "I just didn't expect it to hit this hard. I thought I had learned how to live with loss, but this time it feels different. Heavier." He looked down, his fingers tracing the edge of the coffee cup she'd given him. The quiet stretched again, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything they weren't saying. "Do you remember?" he said suddenly. "When we used to sit after long shoots and talk about what life would be like in 20 years? She smiled faintly. "Yeah. We thought we'd both be living on some island away from everything." "And we both laughed," he said, "because we knew we'd never slow down." Sandra nodded. "Funny how life proves us wrong." They both smiled, but their eyes told another story. One of missed chances, unspoken feelings, and paths that almost crossed again and again. As the evening deepened, they talked for hours. Not about fame or work, but about quiet things. Forgiveness, choices, the small regrets that follow even the best days. It felt like they had both been walking through storms and somehow found the same shore again. But beneath the calm surface, something else stirred. A question neither dared to ask. As Keanu got up to leave, the rain had stopped. The air smelled clean, renewed. He turned toward the door but paused. "Thank you," he said softly, for opening the door. You didn't have to knock, she replied with a small smile. You could have just walked in. He smiled back. Maybe next time. He walked out into the misty night, and for a brief moment, she stood at the doorway, watching him fade into the fog. Something inside her whispered that this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something neither of them had expected. She closed the door, her heart strangely lighter, yet filled with a sense of anticipation she hadn't felt in years. As she turned off the lights and went upstairs, she didn't notice the small envelope that had slipped from Keanu's pocket and landed by the doorway. The faint letters on it read her name, written in his handwriting, and inside, sealed but not forgotten, was the truth that would change everything between them. The letter by the door the next morning. The air was still heavy with the scent of rain. Sunlight crept through the curtains, soft and golden, brushing across the wooden floor. Sandra woke up slowly, the silence of the house feeling strangely peaceful after the night before. For a few moments, she just lay there, her mind drifting back to the unexpected visit. Keanu's voice still echoed in her head, calm, tired, and full of something unspoken. She smiled faintly, remembering the warmth in his eyes, and then frowned as she realized how abruptly he had left. It had all felt unfinished, like a chapter closed too soon. She made her way downstairs, still barefoot, and paused at the bottom step. That was when she saw it, a small, slightly crumpled envelope lying near the door. She bent down to pick it up. Her name was written across the front in a familiar, uneven handwriting. The ink had smudged slightly, probably from the rain. She turned it over in her hands, her heartbeat quickening. She sat down on the couch, took a deep breath, and carefully opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper, aged and soft at the edges. The first line stopped her heart for a second. Dear Sandra, if you're reading this, it means I finally found the courage to leave this here. She froze. The handwriting, the tone, it was unmistakably Keanu. He must have written it long before last night. Her hands trembled as she read further. I've tried many times to say these words face to face, but life kept moving too fast. I thought I could let time wash them away, but the truth has stayed with me all these years. I never told you what really happened the night before our last shoot. The night you waited for me at the old restaurant and I never showed up. Her chest tightened. She remembered that night vividly. She had waited for hours, thinking he might have been delayed or called away. When he didn't come, she convinced herself it didn't matter. She buried the disappointment under a layer of professionalism and silence. She read on. I was supposed to meet you. I had something to tell you. Something that could have changed everything. But on my way there, I got a call. Someone I cared for had been in an accident. I left without thinking, and by the time I came back, it was too late. You had already left the city. I didn't reach out, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how to explain disappearing like that. I thought maybe it was better if you believed I'd just forgotten, but I never did. Her fingers tightened around the paper. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. You once told me that people enter our lives when we're ready to learn something. I think I was meant to learn what regret feels like. I've carried it for years. The silence, the distance, the words I should have said. And now, after losing someone again, I realized life doesn't wait for perfect timing. So I came to see you, not to fix the past, but to finally be honest about it. You were right, Sandra. We can't choose when the world gives us peace, but we can choose who we let in when it does. The letter ended without a signature. She just sat there, the words echoing inside her chest like an old melody she had forgotten. Outside, the rain had started again, light and steady. She looked out the window, her reflection faint against the glass. For years, she had convinced herself that some moments were meant to fade. But this felt like a beginning she didn't know she wanted. She folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table. Every part of her wanted to call him, to ask him what he meant, to tell him how much that night had haunted her too. But something held her back. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the fragile beauty of the truth she had just read. Later that afternoon, as the rain slowed, she decided to go for a walk. She needed air, space, clarity. The streets were empty, washed clean by the storm. She wandered aimlessly until she found herself near the park they used to visit between shoots. a quiet place filled with old trees and wooden benches, and there, sitting under one of the trees, was Keanu. He looked up when he saw her, his expression unreadable. She walked slowly toward him, holding the letter in her hand. He stood up, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The sound of dripping leaves filled the silence between them. "You dropped this," she said softly, handing him the envelope. He looked at it, then at her. "I guess I did. You wrote it a long time ago?" she asked. He nodded. "I did. I wasn't sure if I'd ever give it to you, but last night felt like the right time." "Why now?" she asked. Her voice was calm, but her eyes searched his face. Keanu hesitated. "Because I realized I've spent too many years hiding from the truth. And the truth is, you mattered to me more than I ever said." Sandra's eyes softened. "You mattered too, Keanu, more than I ever admitted." They stood there for a while, both unsure what to do with the years between them. The past wasn't something that could be fixed with one conversation, but it could be understood. "I never stopped respecting you," he said quietly, "even when life pulled us apart." "And I never stopped believing you'd show up," she replied. He smiled gently, a kind of smile that came from relief rather than joy. "Maybe we both needed time." "Or maybe," she said, "we both needed loss to remind us what really matters." The sky began to clear, sunlight spilling through the clouds. A small beam of light fell across their faces. Keanu glanced at the bench beside them. "Sit with me?" She nodded, and they sat side by side, the letter resting between them like a fragile bridge. They talked, not about the past, but about who they had become since. The kind of people who understood silence, patience, and forgiveness. But as the conversation deepened, Sandra noticed something in his voice. A quiet struggle he was trying to hide. His words slowed, his eyes distant, as if part of him was somewhere else. "Are you okay?" she asked. He looked at her, a faint smile touching his lips. "I will be," he said softly. It was an answer that wasn't really an answer. When she walked home later, the world felt lighter, yet her heart carried a strange unease. Something about him had felt off, like he was preparing to leave again. But this time, for a reason he couldn't control. That night, she placed the letter in her journal next to a photograph from years ago, the two of them laughing on set, unaware of how time would test them. As she closed the book, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Keanu. "Thank you for today. If I don't see you tomorrow, please don't worry. Some things need to be faced alone. I'll explain soon." She stared at the message for a long time, her heart pounding in her chest. She typed back a single line. "Whatever it is, you don't have to face it alone." But before she could press send, her screen went dark. A sudden power outage filled the house with silence. Outside, thunder rolled again, and the faint sound of sirens echoed in the distance. Sandra stood by the window, her breath shallow, as the lights flickered once and then died completely, and somewhere across the city, Keanu Reeves had disappeared again, without a word, without a trace. The silence before the storm, the rain had stopped, but the world outside still felt heavy and uncertain. Sandra sat on the couch, staring at her dark phone screen, the words of Keanu's message replaying in her mind again and again. "If I don't see you tomorrow, please don't worry. Some things need to be faced alone." She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Keanu had always been the kind of man who carried pain quietly, who vanished when life grew too loud. But this felt different. His eyes yesterday had carried a kind of stillness that didn't belong to peace. It belonged to someone preparing for something final. She tried to convince herself that she was overthinking it. Maybe he just needed time. Maybe he was visiting someone. But a quiet voice inside her whispered that he was hiding something. Something he didn't want her to see. The next morning, she drove to his apartment. It was a simple place on the edge of the city, quiet and private, surrounded by trees. She had been there once years ago when they were working together. Back then, the place had felt warm, filled with books, guitars, and half-written notes on the table. Now, as she stood in front of the door, everything felt colder. She knocked gently, waiting. No sound. She knocked again, louder this time. Nothing. She tried calling his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. She hesitated for a moment, then reached under the small potted plant near the door. He always used to keep a spare key there. It was still there, slightly dusty. She unlocked the door slowly and stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of rain and old paper. The curtains were drawn, but a small beam of light slipped through, illuminating the dust in the air. Everything was neatly arranged, too neatly. The calmness of the space made her uneasy. She looked around. On the coffee table there was a cup of tea, untouched and cold. Beside it, an open notebook. She picked it up. The pages were filled with thoughts written in his familiar handwriting. Small reflections, fragments of sentences, half-formed ideas. Life doesn't end with loss. It continues quietly in small gestures of kindness. Forgiveness is not a gift to others. It's a way to stay alive. And then, near the last page, she saw something that made her heart race. If she finds this, tell her I'm sorry for not saying goodbye properly. Her breath caught. She turned the page, blank. Another, blank, Keanu? She whispered, her voice trembling. No answer. On the kitchen counter, she noticed a folded note held down by a small photograph. The two of them from years ago, smiling at a film set under bright sunlight. The note had her name written on it again. She opened it slowly. Dear Sandra, please don't panic. I just need to be away for a while. There's something I have to do. Something I promised someone long ago. I can't explain now, but I will once it's done. I didn't mean to disappear again. I just didn't want to pull you into this. You've already carried enough for both of us. I left the letter for you because I didn't want you to think I walked away without a reason. I didn't. I'm doing this because I owe it to someone, and maybe in a way to myself. Don't come looking for me. If everything goes right, I'll see you soon. If not, know that I was grateful for yesterday. It reminded me what real peace feels like. Keanu, her eyes blurred as she reached the end of the note. Her pulse quickened. Don't come looking for me. She could almost hear his voice saying it, calm, steady, but filled with quiet pain. But she couldn't just sit there. Not this time. Not again. She folded the note carefully, tucked it into her coat, and stepped outside. She didn't know where to go, but her instincts pulled her toward the city's outskirts, toward a small hospital she knew he sometimes volunteered at. It was the kind of place Keanu often visited quietly, helping people, never speaking about it publicly. When she arrived, the nurse at the counter recognized her immediately. Hi, Sandra said, her voice low. I'm looking for Keanu Reeves. He might have come here recently. The nurse hesitated. He was here earlier this week, she said softly. But not as a visitor. Sandra's stomach tightened. What do you mean? The nurse lowered her voice. He came in for some tests. I can't share details, but he looked unwell, pale, tired. He said he didn't want anyone to worry. Sandra stepped back slowly, her hands trembling. She could feel the air leave her lungs. She had noticed it. The way his hands shook slightly when he held the coffee cup, the fatigue in his eyes, the way he avoided certain questions. He hadn't been running from something. He had been hiding it. When she returned to her car, she couldn't move for several minutes. Rain began to fall again, gentle and cold, blurring the world outside the windshield. She pressed her head against the steering wheel and let the tears come. Quietly, helplessly. Memories flooded her mind. His laughter, the way he listened without interrupting, the quiet way he carried other people's pain as if it were his own. And now, knowing that he had been silently fighting something, her heart broke in ways she didn't know it could. By evening, she made a decision. She couldn't just wait for him to reach out. She would find him. She called an old friend, one of the few people who had stayed close to Keanu through the years, his old stunt coordinator, Michael. When he picked up, his voice sounded tired. Hey, Sandra said. I need to ask you something. Have you heard from Keanu? There was a pause. Too long? Yeah, Michael said finally. He called me 2 nights ago. Said he was leaving town for a few days. Something about fulfilling an old promise. He didn't say where? Did he sound okay? Michael hesitated again. Honestly, no. He sounded like someone trying to make peace with something. He said he might not be reachable for a while. Sandra closed her eyes. Did he mention anyone's name? Or where he was going? No, but he asked me to give you something if anything happened. What? A small box. He told me not to open it. He said it was yours. Sandra's breath caught. Where is it? At my place. Do you want to come get it? I'll be there in 30 minutes. The drive to Michael's place felt endless. The night had deepened, and the roads glistened with reflections of streetlights. When she arrived, Michael met her at the door, holding a small wooden box, simple, old-fashioned, with a faint engraving on top. She took it carefully. It was heavier than it looked. He dropped it off the day before yesterday, Michael said quietly. Told me you'd understand when the time came. She nodded slowly, her hands shaking as she held it close. When she reached home, she placed the box on the table and just stared at it. Part of her wanted to open it immediately, but another part of her was afraid of what truth it might hold. After a long pause, she lifted the lid. Inside was a folded letter and a small silver pendant. The pendant had the engraving of a tree, the same symbol from a charity they had once supported together years ago. After a friend's passing, she opened the letter. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone somewhere I needed to be. Maybe it's temporary, maybe not. But I didn't want to leave without giving you something that reminded you of why we met in the first place, to bring light where loss once lived. The pendant belonged to someone who once told me that real strength is quiet. I think you've always had that kind of strength, Sandra. Maybe that's why I found peace in your presence. Don't try to find me yet. When it's time, I'll send you a sign. She clutched the pendant tightly, her heart pounding. The rain outside turned into a storm again, thunder rolling across the distance. She looked out the window, the city lights flickering like distant stars. And then her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She hesitated before answering. Hello? A voice, faint and rough, spoke on the other end. Sandra, it's me. Her breath caught. Keanu, where are you? There was a long pause. She could hear wind in the background and something that sounded like waves. I'm at the place where it all began, he said softly. Don't come yet, please. I just need to finish what I started. What are you talking about? Keanu, you're scaring me. But before he could answer, the line went silent, and for the first time, she realized what he meant by the place where it all began. It wasn't a metaphor. It was real. The lake house. The one from years ago. The one where their story had started long before either of them understood what it meant. Her heart raced as she grabbed her keys and stepped out into the storm. She was going after him, no matter what waited there. The lake of memories, the storm had followed her all the way out of the city. Thunder rolled across the sky like a warning, and flashes of lightning illuminated the empty road ahead. Sandra's hands tightened on the steering wheel, her eyes fixed on the distant outline of the forest. She knew this road. She had driven it years ago, back when everything between them had been simpler. Before fame, before distance, before silence. The lake house stood on the far edge of the woods, half hidden by trees. They had once spent long afternoons there between shoots, talking about life, dreams, and the strange loneliness that came with being understood by millions, but truly known by no one. As she approached, the sight of it sent a shiver through her chest. The house looked the same, quiet, still, waiting. Only the soft glow of a single lamp from inside broke the darkness. She parked the car and stepped out. The rain had turned into a steady drizzle. The wooden porch creaked under her feet as she walked up. For a moment, she hesitated. Her hand hovered over the door. Then she knocked, softly at first, then again. No answer. She pushed the door open. The air inside was cool, carrying the faint scent of cedar and old rain. The fireplace was burning low, casting long shadows across the room. On the table near the window sat Keanu, his back turned to her, a book open in his hands. He didn't look surprised when she entered. In fact, it almost seemed like he had been expecting her. You came, he said quietly without turning. Sandra stepped closer, her voice trembling. You didn't give me much choice. He smiled faintly. I told you not to come. You also said you'd explain, she replied. So explain. He closed the book and set it aside. When he finally turned toward her, she saw it. The exhaustion behind his calm, the pale tone of his skin, the weight in his eyes. "You were right," she whispered. "Something's wrong." He looked away, his jaw tightening. "It's nothing dramatic. Just something I should have told you sooner." "Don't do that," she said. "Don't make it sound small. I went to your apartment, Keanu. I saw the notes. I talked to the nurse." His eyes flickered, and for a moment the mask fell. The quiet strength he always carried gave way to something raw. "It's not something that can be fixed," he said softly. "I've been going through treatment for a while now. It's been getting harder. I didn't want anyone to know. Not because I was ashamed, but because I wanted to keep living, not waiting." Sandra's throat tightened. "How long have you known?" "A little over a year, and you didn't tell me?" He looked up, his voice steady but filled with regret. "What would I have said? That I'm scared? That I don't want people to look at me with pity? I wanted to keep my life quiet, normal. And then, after losing someone again, I realized there was one thing I hadn't done right, saying what I needed to say to you." She took a slow step closer, her voice trembling. "So you came to me that night?" "Because you thought it might be your last chance." He nodded slightly. "Maybe part of me did." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The rain against the windows filled the silence. Sandra walked toward the fireplace, staring into the flames. Her hands trembled, but she didn't want him to see. "You're not facing this alone," she said firmly. "Whatever happens, I'm staying." "You don't have to," he said gently. "I came here to find peace, not to drag you into my fear." "You're not dragging me anywhere," she said. "You're giving me a chance to do something right, to be there." He looked at her, his expression softening, as though her words had reached the part of him that still wanted to hope. They sat by the fire for hours, sometimes talking, sometimes just listening to the sound of the rain. He told her about the charity work he had continued quietly, about the letters he had written to people who never knew his name. She told him about her struggles with loneliness, about how success had never filled the spaces she thought it would. As the night deepened, their conversation turned quieter, more intimate. "Do you ever think," she asked softly, "that maybe we met too early?" Keanu smiled faintly. "Maybe. Or maybe we met at the exact time we were meant to, just not for the reason we thought." "And what reason was that?" "To teach each other how to heal," he said. Sandra felt a tear slip down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. "You always say things like that," she whispered. "Like you already know the ending." He looked at her, his voice barely a whisper. "Maybe I just accept it sooner." For a moment, the fire crackled softly between them. She reached across and placed her hand over his. It was warm, but trembling slightly. He didn't pull away. "You once told me," she said, "that love isn't about fixing someone. It's about standing beside them while they rebuild themselves. Maybe that's what we're supposed to do now." Keanu's lips curved into a faint smile. "You remember that?" Every word. Outside, the storm began to ease, and a soft mist rose over the lake. Through the window, they could see the reflection of the moon breaking through the clouds. He looked out at it and said quietly, "That view used to remind me of everything I wanted. Now it just reminds me to be grateful for what I've already had." "Don't start talking like that," she said quickly. "You're not done yet." He laughed softly, a sound filled with warmth and sadness. "You always did hate when people spoke in metaphors, especially when they sound like goodbyes." The laughter faded, and silence returned. After a long pause, he reached into his coat pocket and handed her a small, worn notebook. "I started writing again," he said. "Letters, thoughts, things I never said. If something happens, I want you to keep them." She shook her head. "No, you'll give them to me yourself. Promise me," he said quietly. "Keanu, please." She looked into his eyes, calm, certain, and full of that same quiet strength she had always known. Finally, she nodded. "Okay, I promise." They sat there until the fire burned down to embers. Eventually, he leaned back, his eyes growing heavy. She watched him drift toward sleep, his breathing slow and steady. She stayed awake beside him, the notebook resting in her lap. She opened it, flipping through the pages filled with words written in careful handwriting. There were letters to friends, reflections on loss, notes about kindness, and then near the end, a page with her name at the top. Dear Sandra, I don't know how to write about what you mean to me without sounding like I'm saying goodbye. Maybe love isn't always about staying together. Sometimes it's about being remembered kindly, honestly, by the one person who saw who you really were. Thank you for seeing me. She closed the notebook, her vision blurring. She wanted to wake him, to tell him she wasn't going anywhere. But when she looked at him, peaceful, finally resting, she couldn't bring herself to disturb him. She sat beside him until the sky began to lighten. The rain had stopped completely. The lake shimmered in the first light of dawn, and then she noticed it. His hand had slipped from hers. His breathing was softer now. Too soft. Panic surged through her. Keanu, she whispered, shaking his shoulder gently. Keanu, wake up. No response. She called his name again, louder this time, her voice breaking. Keanu, but the room remained silent. The world outside was still, the morning birds beginning to sing. Tears blurred her vision as she reached for the phone with trembling hands. But just as she started to dial, something stopped her. On the table beside him was a small note, folded once, with her name written on it. She opened it, her breath catching at the first line. I told you I'd send you a sign. And beneath it, in smaller handwriting, the sunrise is yours now. Her sobs filled the quiet room as she looked toward the window. The sun was rising over the lake, painting the water in gold. He was gone. But the peace on his face told her that. Somehow he had left exactly the way he wanted, quietly, in the place where their story had begun. The echoes of Goodbye the Lake was silent the next morning. Mist floated above the still water like a ghostly veil, and the air carried that strange, hollow calm that follows after a storm. Sandra stood on the porch of the lake house, wrapped in his old jacket, staring out into the quiet horizon. Her eyes were swollen, her hands trembling slightly as they clutched the edge of the railing. Inside, everything felt frozen in time. The faint scent of coffee, the soft crackle of ashes in the fireplace, his book still open on the table. It was as if the world had stopped breathing the moment he did. She had called the authorities. They came, gentle and respectful, understanding the gravity of who he was, not just the man the world adored, but the quiet soul who had chosen solitude over fame. They asked questions, took notes, then left her alone. And now only the sound of soft waves remained. She walked back inside, her gaze falling on the notebook he had left her. It lay where she had placed it last night, on the couch beside his folded scarf. For a moment, she couldn't bring herself to open it again. Every page felt sacred, every word a heartbeat she could still hear. Finally, she sat down, her fingers brushing over the worn cover. She opened it slowly, turning to the page where she had stopped, her name written in his careful handwriting. Beneath it, more words waited. I don't want my story to end with silence. I want it to end with peace. If you're reading this, it means I found it. Not in the absence of pain, but in the acceptance of it. I used to think loss meant emptiness. Now I know it means love that never found a place to rest. You gave mine a home. Sandra's hands shook as she traced the lines. His voice seemed to echo through the words, soft and familiar. She turned the page. There were letters to others, people from his past, names she recognized and some she didn't. He had written apologies, gratitude, even small jokes. And at the end of each, he had signed one simple phrase, stay kind. Near the final pages, she found one that stopped her completely. It wasn't written like a letter. It was a list, things I never said. I was happiest when we were quiet. I wanted to tell her that I stayed because she made silence feel safe. I wish I had told her that love doesn't always need to be declared. Sometimes it just needs to be shared. If I could go back, I would have kept knocking on her door. Sandra closed the notebook and pressed it against her heart. Tears came again, but softer this time. She wasn't just crying for what was gone. She was crying for what had been real. As the day passed, she wandered around the house, touching small traces of him. The half-burned candle, the jacket on the chair, the guitar leaning against the wall. Everything carried his presence. Everything whispered his quiet way of existing. Simple, humble, honest. In the afternoon, she stepped outside to the dock. The water shimmered beneath the sunlight, calm and endless. She sat down, letting her feet dangle above the surface. For the first time, she didn't feel the urge to speak or think. She just listened. To the wind, to the birds, to the memory of his laughter somewhere between them. When the sun began to sink, she opened her phone. There were missed calls, messages, reporters trying to reach her, friends offering condolences. She turned the phone off. This moment wasn't for the world. It was for him and for her. That night, she lit a single candle by the window and read his words aloud, page by page, as if keeping him company one last time. Grief is not the enemy of love. It is proof that love existed. She repeated that line over and over, until it became a rhythm in her chest. The next morning, she decided to leave the lake house, but not before taking one last walk along the shore. As she walked, something glimmered near the edge of the water. She bent down and picked it up. It was a small piece of driftwood with faint carvings on it. The letters were rough, almost childlike, but clear enough to read. "Be still." She smiled through her tears. It was something he used to say when she was anxious on set or nervous before interviews. "Be still," he would whisper, "and everything else will follow." She carried the piece of wood back inside, placed it beside the notebook, and whispered, "I hear you." As she locked the house and walked to her car, she looked back one last time. The sunrise reflected off the windows, casting a warm, golden glow. For a second, it looked almost alive, like the house itself was breathing. She drove back to the city in silence. Every mile felt heavier, but there was something new inside her, too, a quiet strength she couldn't explain. She knew that pain wouldn't fade quickly, but she also knew he had left her something far greater than sorrow. He had left her purpose. In the days that followed, she avoided cameras and calls. She stayed home, rereading his notebook, searching for meaning in every line. And then, near the very last page, she found a folded photograph tucked inside. It was the two of them, years ago, sitting beside the same lake, laughing like children. On the back, in his handwriting, were just 3 words: "Don't stop shining." That night she made a decision. She called his old foundation, the small, quiet charity they had once supported together for children who lost parents. The same one that used the tree pendant as its symbol. She offered to take over its management, not in his name, but in his spirit. When she spoke to the team, she said only one thing: "This isn't about his fame. It's about his kindness. I want to continue that." Weeks passed. The world mourned him in headlines and tributes, but she stayed away from the noise. Instead, she spent her time writing letters to those he had once helped, reading to children at the foundation, and quietly living the words he left behind. But one evening, as she was closing the office, she noticed an envelope slipped under the door. Her name was written on it. Again in his handwriting, her heart skipped. It couldn't be. She picked it up with trembling hands, sat down, and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "You found the foundation. I knew you would. If you're reading this, it means Michael kept his promise. I gave him this letter to deliver when you took my place. Thank you for not letting me disappear completely. Thank you for turning goodbye into something beautiful. Every sunrise is still ours." Her tears fell freely now, but they no longer felt like sorrow. They felt like sunlight, like a promise kept between two souls who had learned that love doesn't always end. It transforms. Later that night, she drove back to the lake house one last time. She stood by the water, holding the letter in her hands, and whispered, "You kept your word." The wind moved gently across the surface of the lake, and for a brief moment, the reflection of the moon shimmered like a smile. She knew then that he hadn't really gone. He was everywhere, in the light, in the stillness, in the quiet strength that now lived inside her. And for the first time in a long while, Sandra closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and finally felt peace. The light he left behind a full year had passed since that morning at the lake. Yet sometimes when the world fell quiet, Sandra still heard the faint echo of his voice, calm, steady, filled with that same gentle truth that had guided her through everything. She had kept her promise. The foundation he built was now alive again, fuller than ever. It wasn't just a charity anymore. It had become a home for people who had lost their way, children, artists, and quiet souls who needed light when life had turned dim. Every wall carried photos, not of fame or movies, but of small moments. A smile shared, a child's drawing, a letter from someone helped by Keanu years ago. The tree symbol he once wore as a pendant was now engraved above the entrance, glowing softly at night. People came from all over, not to mourn him, but to thank him. And every time they did, Sandra would smile and say, "Don't thank him. Live like him." That's all he ever wanted. But even with all the laughter around her, there were nights when she still found herself alone, standing by the window, holding the old notebook, rereading his words. They had become her scripture, a map of quiet strength. One evening, after a long day at the foundation, she returned home to find a small parcel waiting by her doorstep. There was no return address, only a single line written across the front. "For when you're ready." Her heart skipped. She took it inside and placed it on the table. It wasn't sealed with tape, just a simple string tied in a loose knot. She hesitated for a moment, then untied it. Inside was a small wooden box. She recognized it immediately. It was the same kind he used to keep letters in, the ones he wrote but never sent. She opened the lid. Inside were several envelopes, each labeled with a single word: hope, loss, forgiveness, courage, love. And at the bottom, one more, marked last. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. The handwriting was his, the same slow, careful script that had carried so many of his quiet truths. She opened it, and the first line made her breath catch. "If you're reading this, it means you kept walking, even when it hurt." She sat down, tears already gathering, and continued. "I didn't write this as a goodbye. I wrote it as a reminder. Life isn't measured by how long we have, but by how deeply we live. And I've lived deeply because I met people like you. You once told me you were afraid of endings. But here's the secret. Nothing really ends. Energy doesn't vanish. Love doesn't fade. It just changes form. Maybe I'm no longer beside you, but I'm still here. In the quiet, in the work you do, in every small kindness you choose. Don't stop sharing that. Don't stop shining. And when the days get too heavy, go back to the lake. There's something waiting for you there." She stopped reading, her hands covering her mouth. She didn't wait. She packed the letter into her coat pocket, grabbed her keys, and drove through the night. The road to the lake felt both new and ancient. The forest seemed to breathe around her, alive with whispers of memory. When she reached the lake house, the air was cold and still. The moon hung low, reflecting perfectly in the water. She stepped out, clutching the letter, and walked to the dock, the same one where she had last seen him. As she reached the edge, she noticed something glimmering beneath the wooden planks. Kneeling down, she reached for it. It was a small metal box, half covered in dust and time. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a small voice recorder and a folded photograph. The photo showed the two of them at the Foundation's first event years ago. They were standing under a large tree, smiling, the same tree that now marked the Foundation's symbol. On the back of the photo, he had written, "If you found this, it means you kept believing." She pressed the button on the recorder. Static filled the air for a moment, then his voice came through, soft, warm, steady. "Hey, Sandra. If you're hearing this, I guess you really did come back. I didn't want this to be about sadness. I wanted it to be about peace. I know you. You'll try to carry everyone all at once. But you don't have to. You already gave me more peace than I ever thought I'd find." His voice paused, and she could hear the faint sound of wind and waves behind him. The lake, probably recorded right there. During one of his last days, "I once said the sunrise is yours now," he continued. "But maybe I was wrong. Maybe it's ours, shared by everyone who decides to begin again after loss. So promise me you'll keep doing that. Keep beginning." Another pause. Then, softly, "Thank you for knocking on my door that first day. You changed everything." The recording clicked off. Sandra sat there for a long time, the wind moving gently around her, her tears falling quietly into the lake. It didn't feel like grief anymore. It felt like gratitude. She stayed until dawn. When the first light of morning spread across the sky, she took the pendant from her neck, the one he had left her, and tied it to the old wooden post at the edge of the dock. The sunlight touched the silver, and it shimmered like a small star. "You were right," she whispered. "The sunrise is ours." She stood there, eyes closed, breathing deeply as the warmth of morning wrapped around her. For the first time in a long while, she felt him, not as a memory, not as a ghost, but as a quiet presence, alive in every heartbeat, every ripple of water, every ray of light. Weeks later, she returned to the foundation with a new idea. She gathered the staff and the children and said, "We're starting something new. The Sunrise Project. It'll help people who've lost someone start again, not to forget, but to live." They built benches by the lake, planted trees for every person who found healing there, and inscribed a small plaque on the first one, for Keanu, who taught us that love doesn't end, it transforms. Years passed. The world kept moving, but the lake remained a quiet place where stories began again. People came to sit there, to grieve, to laugh, to heal. And sometimes when the light hit the water just right, it looked as though two figures sat on the dock. One calm, one smiling, watching the sunrise together, and if you listened closely, you could almost hear his voice whisper, "Be still." Sandra smiled every time, because she understood now he was never truly gone. He had just become part of everything good she touched, everything kind she did, everything peaceful she carried. And so the story that began with a knock ended with light, the kind that never fades.